Don't just listen and leave. Hit subscribe so you'll never miss another story that speaks to your soul. Because what I'm about to tell you will make you question everything you think you know about family, loyalty, and the price of betrayal. My name is Clara Orem, and this is the story of how I learned that sometimes the greatest act of love is knowing when to stop giving it unconditionally. If you've ever been taken for granted by someone you die for, if you've ever wondered what happens when endless forgiveness meets its breaking point, then settle in. Because what I'm about to share will change how you think about family forever. But I warn you, this isn't just about a mother's disappointment. This is about what happens when decades of patience finally transform into something much more powerful: justice. The rain fell like tears from heaven on the day I buried my husband. It was the kind of storm that makes you believe the sky itself is mourning, fat droplets hammering the black umbrellas scattered across Greenwood Cemetery like artillery in a war against grief. The funeral of Edmund Orem was everything he would have wanted: dignified, well-attended, and expensive enough to reflect the empire he'd built from nothing but determination and an immigrant's dream. I sat in the front row of folding chairs arranged before his mahogany casket, my black Chanel suit pristine despite the weather, my wide-brimmed hat creating a small island of shadow in the gray afternoon. At 59, I'd learned to carry myself with the kind of grace that makes people whisper about good breeding and old money, even though Edmund and I had clawed our way up from middle-class respectability to genuine wealth over 35 years of marriage. The pastor's voice rose and fell like a hymn as he spoke about Edmund's legacy. The construction company that had grown from a single truck to a multi-million-dollar operation, the jobs he'd created, the buildings that bore his name across 3 states. I listened with the part of my mind that wasn't screaming, nodding at appropriate moments, accepting the gentle touches and whispered condolences from friends and colleagues. But my eyes kept drifting to the empty chair beside me. The chair I'd specifically requested for my daughter, Sonia. The chair that had remained vacant since the service began 30 minutes ago. "She'll be here," I'd whispered to my sister Margaret when people first started asking. "Traffic, you know. It's terrible in this weather." But as the minutes ticked by and the pastor moved into his closing remarks, the whispers grew louder, more pointed. I could feel the curious stares of 300 mourners, the way conversations paused when people noticed the conspicuous absence of Edmund's only child. Margaret leaned close to my ear, her voice barely audible above the rain drumming on the funeral tent. "Clara, honey, I'm getting worried. Has anyone heard from Sonia today?" I was about to respond when my phone buzzed against my clutch. A text message from my niece Jennifer, Sonia's cousin who'd been her maid of honor just 3 years ago. "Aunt Clara, I'm so sorry. You need to see this." Attached was a screenshot of an Instagram story. My daughter Sonia, radiant in a gold sequin dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, arms wrapped around her husband Marcus as they posed at what was clearly a lavish party. The location tag read, "Marcus's 35th birthday bash, Villa Rosa." The timestamp showed it had been posted 20 minutes ago. 20 minutes ago, while I was listening to eulogies for her father. I stared at the image until my vision blurred, though whether from tears or rage, I couldn't tell. There was my 32-year-old daughter, the child Edmund and I had sacrificed everything to give every advantage, raising a champagne flute in celebration while her father was being lowered into the ground. The phone slipped from my numb fingers and clattered onto the muddy grass. "Clara?" Margaret's voice seemed to come from very far away. "What is it?" I couldn't answer.
Couldn't speak.
Could barely breathe as the full weight of my daughter's betrayal crashed over me like a physical blow. People were starting to stand. The service concluded, but I remained seated as if the chair had grown roots. Around me, mourners began the slow procession toward their cars, offering final condolences as they passed. "She'll regret missing this," someone said softly. "I'm sure she had a good reason," Another voice offered with false kindness. Such a shame. Edmund would have been heartbroken. Edmund would have been heartbroken. The words cut through my shock like a blade, and suddenly I could breathe again, could think again, could feel the cold fury that was beginning to crystallize in my chest where my heart used to be. I picked up my phone and looked at the image again. This time, I noticed details I'd missed in my initial shock. The elaborate decorations that must have taken weeks to plan. The dozens of guests clearly having the time of their lives. The professional photographer capturing every moment of Marcus's surprise party. This wasn't some last-minute event Sonia had been guilted into attending. This was something she'd known about, planned for, chosen over her father's funeral. She'd made her choice. Now I would make mine. As the funeral director approached to discuss the final arrangements, I stood with a fluid grace that had been drilled into me at the finishing school Edmund's success had allowed me to attend in my 40s. My legs felt steady beneath me, my voice clear when I spoke. "Please have my husband's flowers delivered to the mausoleum," I told him. "All of them. Every single arrangement." He nodded, making notes on his clipboard. "Of course, Mrs. Oram." "And the family gathering afterward?" I looked out over the cemetery, where Edmund's business partners and longtime friends were still clustered under umbrellas, clearly expecting to follow us back to the house for the traditional reception. "Cancelled," I said simply. Margaret grabbed my arm. "Clara, you can't." "Watch me," I said, and something in my voice made her step back. I walked to where the largest group of mourners was gathered and cleared my throat. The conversations died instantly. "Thank you all for coming today to honor my husband's memory," I said, my voice carrying clearly despite the rain. "Edmund would have been deeply touched by your presence and your love. However, I'm afraid I must cancel the reception plan for this afternoon. Something urgent has come up that requires my immediate attention." The murmurs started immediately, but I didn't wait to hear them. I turned and walked toward the waiting limousine with my head held high, my spine straight, my steps measured and deliberate. Behind me, I heard Margaret making hurried explanations to confused relatives, but I didn't look back. I couldn't. If I stopped moving, if I allowed myself to feel the full weight of this betrayal, I might crumble right there in the mud and never get up again. The limousine was warm and quiet, a cocoon of leather and privilege that Edmund's hard work had made possible. As we pulled away from the cemetery, I allowed myself one last look at his gravesite through the rain-streaked window. "I'm sorry, my love," I whispered to his memory, "but I can't protect her anymore. I won't." That night, I sat alone in Edmund's study, surrounded by the mahogany shelves filled with books he'd actually read, the awards and photos that chronicled our rise from ambitious young couple to pillars of the community. His desk still smelled like his cologne, something expensive I'd bought him for our last anniversary when we'd still believed we had years ahead of us. I poured myself 3 fingers of his favorite whiskey and opened my laptop. Sonia's social media was a catalog of celebration and excess. Photo after photo of her at Marcus's party, each one more insulting than the last. Her in that golden dress, laughing with friends who'd never worked a day in their privileged lives. Marcus feeding her cake while she giggled like a teenager. The two of them dancing while a jazz band played in the background. At the bottom of her latest post, dozens of comments from friends and acquaintances. Most were celebratory, but a few caught my attention. "Wait, wasn't your dad's funeral today? Girl, this is not a good look. Some things are more important than parties, just saying." But Sonia had responded to these with laughing emojis and defensive comments about how her father would have wanted her to be happy and how life goes on. Life goes on. As if Edmund's death was just an inconvenience to be worked around, a speed bump on the highway to her endless entertainment. I closed the laptop and stared at Edmund's portrait hanging above the fireplace. He looked stern in his formal business attire, but I could see the warmth in his eyes, the pride he'd carried for the family we'd built together. "What would you do?" I asked his image. "How do we reach a daughter who's forgotten everything we taught her?" But even as I asked the question, I knew Edmund would never have tolerated this level of disrespect. He'd been kind and generous to a fault, but he'd also been a man who understood consequences, who believed that actions should have weight and meaning. I finished my whiskey and made a decision that would change everything. Picking up my phone, I scrolled through my contacts until I found the number I was looking for. James Hartwell, our family attorney and one of Edmund's oldest friends. It was nearly midnight, but I knew James would answer. He'd been like a brother to Edmund, and he'd loved Sonia like she was his own niece. He would understand what needed to be done. The phone rang twice before his familiar voice answered. "Clara? I was just thinking about you. How are you holding up?" "I need to see you first thing tomorrow morning," I said without preamble. "It's about Sonia's inheritance." A pause. "Clara, perhaps you should wait a few days before making any major decisions. Grief can." "This isn't grief talking, James," I interrupted. "This is 32 years of enabling talking. And it's over." Another pause, longer this time. "What do you want to do?" I looked up at Edmund's portrait one more time, drawing strength from the memory of the man who'd built our fortune through sheer determination and uncompromising principles. "I want to teach our daughter a lesson about respect," I said. "And I want to make sure she never forgets it." The next morning dawned clear and cold, as if the storm had washed the world clean and left behind something harder, more honest. I woke before sunrise, as I had every day since Edmund's diagnosis 6 months ago, but this time there was no hospital to rush to, no treatments to coordinate, no false hope to maintain. There was only the choice I'd made in the whiskey-scented darkness of his study. I dressed with particular care, a navy blue suit that Edmund had always said brought out my eyes, pearls that had been his gift on our 20th anniversary, and the watch he'd bought me when his company went public. If I was going to dismantle the future we'd planned for our daughter, I would do it looking like the woman he'd fallen in love with. James Hartwell's law office occupied the top floor of a downtown high-rise that Edmund's company had built 15 years ago. The irony wasn't lost on me. We'd constructed our own towers, climbed our own mountains, and now I was here to tear down the bridge we'd built to pass our legacy on to the next generation. James was waiting for me in his conference room. Edmund's will spread across the polished table like evidence at a trial. At 65, he still carried himself with the authority that had made him one of the city's most respected attorneys, but I could see the concern in his gray eyes as I took my seat across from him. "Clara," he began gently, "I want you to be absolutely certain about this. What you're proposing, it's final. Once we make these changes, there's no going back." I opened my purse and pulled out my phone, navigating to Sonia's Instagram account. The photos from Marcus's party were still there, each one a fresh wound. "Look at this," I said, sliding the phone across the table. "This is what she chose to do while we buried her father." James picked up the phone and scrolled through the images, his expression growing more troubled with each swipe. I watched his face change as he took in the extravagance, the timing, the sheer callousness of it all. "When was this posted?" he asked quietly. "During the service. While the pastor was reading Edmund's favorite scripture, she was toasting her husband's birthday." James set the phone down carefully, as if it might explode. "Have you spoken to her? Given her a chance to explain?" I almost laughed, but the sound that came out was bitter and sharp. "Explain what, James? How do you explain choosing a party over your father's funeral? How do you explain 32 years of taking everything and giving nothing back? Clara, do you remember when she was 16 and wrecked Edmund's Mercedes?" I asked, my voice growing stronger as the memories flooded back. "We replaced it without question because teenagers make mistakes. Do you remember when she dropped out of college 3 times because she couldn't decide what she wanted to study? We kept paying tuition because finding yourself takes time. James nodded slowly. He'd been there for all of it, had witnessed our endless patience and unconditional support. Do you remember her wedding? I continued. $200,000 for one day because it was her dream wedding, and she deserved to be a princess. Edmund worked himself into exhaustion that year to pay for it, and she complained because the champagne wasn't vintage enough. I remember, James said softly. And then there was the down payment on their house. The monthly allowance, because Marcus's art career wasn't quite taking off. The credit card bills we kept paying because they were establishing themselves. The designer clothes, the vacations, the jewelry. I was standing now, pacing behind my chair like a caged animal. 32 years of saying yes to everything, and this is how she honors her father's memory. I stopped pacing and faced James directly. She made her choice, James. Now I'm making mine. He was quiet for a long moment, studying the wool spread out before him. What exactly do you want to do? I sat back down and opened my purse again, this time pulling out a piece of paper I'd prepared that morning. My demands, written in the careful script that finishing school had drilled into me decades ago. I want Sonia removed from Edmund's will entirely, I said. The trust fund, the property investments, the life insurance payout, all of it goes back to the estate. James picked up the paper and read it carefully. Clara, this is $8 million we're talking about. Her entire inheritance. I'm aware of the amount. And you want to leave her nothing? Not even a token amount. I smiled then, the first genuine smile I'd felt since seeing that Instagram post. Oh, I want to leave her something. I want to leave her exactly $1. James blinked. $1. $1. And a note explaining why. The attorney in him took over, his voice becoming formal and cautious. Clara, I have to advise you that this could be contested. Sonia could claim undue influence, emotional distress, any number of. Let her try, I said calmly. She'll have to explain to a court why she was at a party instead of her father's funeral. She'll have to justify 32 years of taking without giving. She'll have to convince 12 strangers that she deserved $8 million despite showing no respect for the man who earned it. James was quiet again, his pen hovering over the documents. What about Marcus? This affects him too. Marcus has never worked a day in his life. He married Sonia for her money and her family connections, and he's spent 3 years encouraging her worst impulses. If anything, this might be the best thing that ever happened to him. It might force him to develop actual character. And if Sonia comes to you? If she apologizes? I thought about this carefully. It was the question I'd been asking myself all morning, the scenario that could weaken my resolve if I wasn't prepared for it. If she comes to me, I said finally, she'll have to prove that her apology is genuine. Words are cheap, James. After 32 years of pretty speeches followed by ugly actions, I'm only interested in behavior. James nodded and began making notes on the will. We'll need witnesses, notarization, the full legal process. Are you sure you want to do this today? I'm sure. And the note you mentioned? I pulled out another piece of paper, this one filled with my careful handwriting. I've already prepared it. James read it aloud, his voice growing quieter with each word. My dear daughter, I have left you $1, not because I don't love you, but because I do. Perhaps when you have nothing handed to you, you will finally learn the value of everything you've been given. Your father and I tried to teach you that family comes first, that respect is earned, and that privilege comes with responsibility. Since our words failed to reach you, perhaps our actions will. I pray that one day you will understand that this is not punishment, it is education. All my love, Mother. The silence in the room was complete except for the ticking of the antique clock on James's desk. Finally, he looked up at me with something that might have been admiration. This is comprehensive, he said. I've had 32 years to think about it. Over the next 3 hours, we methodically dismantled the financial future Edmund and I had built for our daughter. Every trust fund, every investment account, every carefully planned inheritance, all of it redirected to charities and causes that Edmund had supported during his lifetime. When we were finished, Sonia's inheritance consisted of exactly $1 and a mother's broken heart disguised as tough love. There's one more thing, I said as James prepared the final documents for my signature. I want to host a family gathering to read the will. Something formal, with all the relatives present. James looked up from his papers. Clara, are you sure that's wise? This is going to be humiliating for Sonia. Good, I said simply. Humiliation might be the only teacher she has left. And when do you want to do this? I thought about the timing, about the maximum impact of what I was planning. 2 weeks from today. That will give everyone time to arrange their schedules, and it will give Sonia time to post a few more Instagram stories about her fabulous life. James made a note on his calendar. I'll prepare the invitations. Make them formal, I said. I want this to feel like the important family event it is. As I signed the final documents, I felt a strange sense of peace settle over me. For the first time since Edmund's diagnosis, I wasn't wondering what he would want me to do. I knew with absolute certainty that this was right, that this was necessary, that this was the only way to honor both his memory and the values we'd tried to instill in our daughter. The woman who had spent 32 years saying yes to everything was finally learning the power of saying no. And she was just getting started. The invitations went out exactly 1 week after my meeting with James, each one hand-addressed in calligraphy script on cream-colored cardstock thick enough to stop a bullet. I'd insisted on the highest quality paper, the most formal language, the kind of presentation that screamed important family business to anyone who received it. Mrs. Clara Oram requests the honor of your presence at a family gathering for the formal reading of Edmund Oram's last will and testament. Saturday, the 15th of October, 2 o'clock in the afternoon. The Oram family estate. Formal attire requested. I'd sent them to everyone. Edmund's siblings and their children, my sister Margaret and her family, our close family friends who had been like aunts and uncles to Sonia over the years. 37 people in total, all of whom had known and loved Edmund, all of whom had watched Sonia grow up with every advantage money could buy. Most importantly, I'd hand-delivered Sonia's invitation myself. I'd driven to the sprawling house that Edmund's money had bought for her and Marcus, a modern monstrosity in the city's most exclusive neighborhood that looked like it had been designed by someone who confused expense with taste. The circular driveway could accommodate a dozen cars, and the front entrance featured columns that belonged on a government building rather than a private residence. Marcus answered the door, wearing what appeared to be pajama pants and a cashmere sweater that probably cost more than most people's monthly mortgage payment. His dark hair was artfully tousled in that way that takes considerable effort to achieve, and his green eyes held the vague confusion of someone who wasn't accustomed to unexpected visitors. Mrs. Oram, he said, his voice carrying just enough surprise to suggest he wasn't entirely comfortable seeing me. This is unexpected. How are you? Holding up. The phrase holding up was delivered with the kind of practiced sympathy that people use when they want to sound caring without actually engaging with your pain. I'd heard it from dozens of people over the past week, usually followed by some variation of, if there's anything I can do, that everyone knew was just social lubrication. I'm managing quite well, thank you, I replied, my voice carrying the cool politeness I'd perfected during 35 years of society functions. Is Sonia at home? She's in the bath, Marcus said, glancing back toward the interior of the house, as if he expected her to materialize. Should I get her? Is everything all right? I could hear music playing somewhere in the house, something expensive and pretentious that was probably meant to signal sophistication to visitors. The foyer behind Marcus was larger than the first apartment Edmund and I had shared as newlyweds, all marble and modern art that looked like it had been selected by a decorator rather than someone with actual taste. "That won't be necessary," I said, extending the cream-colored envelope toward him. "I just wanted to deliver this personally." Marcus took the invitation and turned it over in his hands, examining the weight of the paper, the formal calligraphy, the wax seal I'd insisted James include for maximum dramatic effect. "What is this?" he asked. "An invitation to the reading of Edmund's will," I said simply. I thought it was important for the family to gather and hear his final wishes together. Something shifted in Marcus's expression, a flicker of interest that he tried to disguise as concern.
"Oh,
"Well, of course we'll be there. Sonia will want to honor her father's memory." Honor her father's memory. The irony was so thick I could taste it. "I'm sure she will," I said. "The gathering is formal, as noted on the invitation. I trust that won't be a problem." "Of course not. We have appropriate attire." I was sure they did. Sonia's walk-in closet was larger than the bedroom Edmund and I had shared for 35 years, filled with designer gowns and shoes that cost more than most people's cars. She'd always understood the importance of looking the part, even when she had no interest in playing the role. "Wonderful," I said. "I look forward to seeing you both there." I turned to leave, but Marcus's voice stopped me. "Mrs. Oram? I just want you to know how sorry we are about missing the funeral." Sonia was absolutely devastated, but there were circumstances beyond our control. I turned back to face him, studying his handsome face for any sign of genuine remorse. What I saw instead was the carefully practiced expression of someone who'd spent his life charming his way out of consequences. "Circumstances," I repeated. "Yes, well, you know how it is. Sometimes life presents us with impossible choices, and we have to do the best we can with imperfect situations." Impossible choices. As if choosing between her father's funeral and her husband's birthday party had been some kind of Sophie's dilemma rather than a simple matter of basic human decency. "Indeed," I said. "Well, I'm sure Sonia will have the opportunity to explain those circumstances at the will reading. Good day, Marcus." I walked back to my car with my spine straight and my head high, knowing that Marcus was watching from the doorway, probably already calculating what Sonia might inherit and how they could best spend it. Let him calculate. Let him plan. Let them both imagine all the wonderful ways they would use Edmund's money to fund their empty, selfish lives. They had no idea what was coming. That evening, I sat in my living room with a cup of tea and my laptop, monitoring Sonia's social media with the dedication of a war correspondent tracking enemy movements. The invitation had been delivered 6 hours ago, and I was curious to see how she would react to this formal acknowledgement of her father's death. The answer came at exactly 9:47 p.m. A new Instagram post featuring a photo of the invitation artfully arranged next to a glass of wine and a designer handbag. The caption read, "Finally time to take care of Daddy's final business crown briefcase, sparkles, #family, #inheritance, #blessed." The hashtags alone were enough to make my blood pressure spike, but it was the crown emoji that really caught my attention. She saw this as her coronation, the moment when she would finally claim the throne that Edmund's hard work had built for her. The comments started almost immediately. "Queen Sonia about to get paid. Your daddy left you the kingdom, girl. Time to collect what's yours. Hope you're ready to be rich, rich." And from Sonia herself, responding to each comment with heart emojis and promises to celebrate properly once everything was official. I screenshotted the entire post and its comments, adding them to the folder I'd been building on my computer. Evidence, I called it, though James probably would have preferred a less prosecutorial term. Documentation of character, perhaps. Or simply proof that some people never learn until the lesson comes with consequences they can't ignore. I finished my tea and closed the laptop, but sleep didn't come easily that night. Instead, I lay in the bed I'd shared with Edmund for 35 years, staring at the ceiling and remembering all the times we talked about our daughter's future. "She's young," Edmund used to say when Sonia would disappoint us with some fresh example of selfishness or entitlement. "She'll grow out of it. When she has children of her own, she'll understand what family really means." But Sonia was 32 now, hardly young by any reasonable standard. And instead of growing out of her selfishness, she seemed to be growing into it, becoming more comfortable with taking and less interested in giving with each passing year. "What would you think of what I'm doing?" I whispered to Edmund's pillow, still faintly scented with his cologne. "Would you understand why I can't keep enabling her?" But even as I asked the question, I knew the answer. Edmund had been a kind man, a generous man, but he'd also been a man who understood that love without boundaries wasn't love at all. It was indulgence. And indulgence, unchecked, eventually destroyed everything it touched. He would understand. He might not like it, might wish there had been another way, but he would understand that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is let them experience the consequences of their choices. I fell asleep holding his pillow, dreaming of the look on Sonia's face when she realized that 32 years of taking everything for granted had finally caught up with her. 8 days until the will reading. 8 days until my daughter learned that actions have consequences, and some lessons can only be taught with pain. I could hardly wait. The morning of the will reading dawned crisp and clear, with the kind of autumn light that makes everything look like it's been painted in gold. I'd been awake since 5, moving through my morning routine with the precision of a general preparing for battle. My outfit had been chosen weeks ago, a black Armani dress that Edmund had bought me for our last anniversary, paired with a pearl necklace that had been his wedding gift to me 35 years ago. Elegant but severe, expensive but not ostentatious. I wanted to look like exactly what I was, a woman of substance who commanded respect. By noon, the caterers had transformed our formal dining room into something suitable for the occasion. Crystal glasses and china that had been wedding gifts caught the light from the chandelier Edmund had installed when his business started turning serious profits. The silver service that we'd only used for the most important occasions gleamed on the mahogany sideboard. Everything was perfect. Everything was ready. The first guests began arriving at 1:30, 30 minutes before the scheduled start time, because my family had always believed in arriving early to important events. My sister Margaret came through the door first, resplendent in navy blue and worry. "Clara, darling, are you absolutely certain about this?" she asked, pulling me aside while her husband chatted with James Hartwell near the piano. "It's not too late to change your mind." "It's been too late for years," I replied, accepting an air kiss and smoothing an imaginary wrinkle from her sleeve. "I should have done this the first time," she disappointed Edmund. "Or the 10th time. Or the 100th time." Margaret's expression was troubled, but she'd known me long enough to recognize when my mind was made up. "Just try to remember that she's still your daughter." "I remember everything," I said. That's precisely the problem. More family members arrived in clusters, filling the house with the kind of respectful conversation that accompanies formal occasions. Edmund's brother David and his wife Susan, their adult children who had always been everything we'd hoped Sonia would become. My cousin Elizabeth and her husband, both of whom had watched Sonia grow up and had probably wondered privately how such loving parents had produced such a selfish child. By 2 o'clock, 36 of the 37 invited guests were present, mingling politely in the living room while James arranged his papers in the dining room. The only person missing was the guest of honor herself. "Should we call her?" Margaret asked, glancing at her watch for the 3rd time in 5 minutes. "She'll be here," I said with certainty. Sonia has never been late to anything involving money. As if summoned by my words, the doorbell rang at exactly 2:15. I walked to the front door myself, wanting to be the first person Sonia saw when she arrived for what she believed would be her financial coronation. She stood on my doorstep like a magazine cover come to life, wearing a red dress that hugged every curve and heels that added 4 inches to her already impressive height. Her dark hair was pulled back in a style that probably required 2 hours and a professional stylist, and her makeup was flawless in that way that took considerable time and expense to achieve. Marcus stood behind her in a charcoal suit that fit him like it had been sewn directly onto his body, his arm possessively around Sonia's waist as if he were afraid she might float away without his anchor. "Mother," Sonia said, leaning in for the kind of perfunctory kiss that people perform when they're being watched. "You look lovely. I'm sorry we're a few minutes late. Traffic was absolutely insane." Traffic. Not remorse about missing her father's funeral, not guilt about the Instagram posts, not acknowledgement of the pain she'd caused. Just traffic. "Not to worry," I said smoothly. "We were just about to begin." I led them into the living room, where the conversation died as every eye turned towards Sonia and Marcus. The looks ranged from polite disapproval to barely concealed disgust, but Sonia seemed oblivious to the temperature of the room. "Uncle David," she exclaimed, embracing Edmund's brother with theatrical enthusiasm. "Aunt Susan, you both look wonderful. How are the grandchildren?" She worked the room like a politician at a fundraiser, dispensing hugs and compliments and acting for all the world like she was the beloved family member returning from a long absence rather than the daughter who had chosen a party over her father's funeral. I watched this performance with fascination, studying the faces of my relatives as Sonia chatted and laughed and behaved as if nothing unusual had happened. Some responded with polite reserve, others with barely concealed coldness, but Sonia seemed genuinely unaware that anything was wrong. "Shall we begin?" James asked, appearing at my elbow with his legal portfolio clutched against his chest. "I think everyone's here now," I said, raising my voice slightly to address the room. "If you would all please join us in the dining room, we can proceed with the reading of Edmund's will." The migration was formal and solemn, 37 people filing into the dining room and taking seats around the table and in chairs we'd borrowed from the funeral home. I took my place at the head of the table, in Edmund's chair, with James standing to my right and Sonia sitting directly across from me. She looked radiant in the afternoon light streaming through the windows, her red dress a splash of color against the formal setting. She caught my eye and smiled, an expression of anticipation and barely contained excitement that made my heart ache for reasons I couldn't quite name. "Before we begin," James said, his voice carrying the gravity appropriate to such occasions, "I want to acknowledge that this is a difficult time for the Oram family. Edmund was a remarkable man who touched many lives, and his legacy will continue through the people he loved and the values he instilled in all of us." Murmurs of agreement rippled around the table. Sonia nodded solemnly, playing the role of grieving daughter with an expertise that might have been impressive if it weren't so insulting. The story broke on social media within hours. I should have expected it, really. In an age where people document their breakfast choices and relationship drama for public consumption, it was inevitable that someone would share the story of the will reading. What I hadn't anticipated was how quickly it would spread, or how mercilessly the court of public opinion would judge my daughter. It started with a Facebook post from one of my younger cousins, a brief account of what had happened, shared with a small group of family friends. But social media has a way of amplifying stories that capture people's imagination, and by evening, the tale of the $1 heiress was being shared across multiple platforms. Entitled Daughter Skips Father's Funeral for Party, Loses $8 million Inheritance. Mother's Savage Revenge. Here's your dollar, honey. When Keeping It Real Goes Right. Family Drama Edition. I discovered this phenomenon when Margaret called me at 9 o'clock that evening, her voice a mixture of excitement and concern. "Clara, you need to see what's happening online," she said without preamble. People are talking about Sonia everywhere. I was sitting in Edmund's study with a glass of wine and a book I wasn't really reading, trying to process the events of the afternoon. The house felt different somehow, lighter, as if a weight I hadn't realized I was carrying had finally been lifted from my shoulders. "What kind of talking?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew. "The bad kind," Margaret said. For her, I mean, people are calling her everything from spoiled to sociopathic. There are memes, Clara. Actual memes about your daughter. I opened my laptop and searched for Sonia's name, immediately regretting the decision. Margaret was right. The internet had seized upon the story with the kind of gleeful cruelty that only anonymous crowds can muster. There were reaction videos from strangers analyzing Sonia's behavior, think pieces about generational entitlement, and countless comments from people sharing their own stories of disappointment with ungrateful family members. The consensus was overwhelming. Sonia had gotten exactly what she deserved. But it was the photos that really caught my attention. Someone had screenshotted the Instagram posts from Marcus's birthday party and juxtaposed them with images from Edmund's funeral. The contrast was devastating. Sonia laughing and toasting while rain fell on her father's casket, celebrating her husband's party while her family mourned. The comments on these posts were brutal. Imagine being this selfish and entitled. Her poor mother. I can't imagine the heartbreak. This is what happens when you never teach your kids consequences. The way she's dressed in that party photo while her dad is being buried. I have no words. That mother is a queen for what she did. Sometimes tough love is the only love left. I closed the laptop, feeling a mixture of satisfaction and sadness that surprised me with its complexity. This wasn't the outcome I had planned, but perhaps it was the one Sonia needed. For 32 years, she had lived in a bubble of privilege and protection, insulated from the consequences of her choices by parents who loved her too much to let her fail. Now the world was teaching her lessons I had been too soft to deliver. My phone rang again, this time an unknown number with a local area code. "Mrs. Oram? This is Jennifer Walsh from Channel 7 News. I was wondering if you'd be available for a brief interview about the situation with your daughter's inheritance. The public is very interested in your story," and I hung up without listening to the rest. Within minutes, my phone was ringing again and again and again. News outlets, podcast hosts, bloggers. Everyone wanted to hear from the mother who had disinherited her daughter for missing a funeral. I turned off my phone and poured myself another glass of wine. The next morning brought a new development. Sonia had hired a lawyer. James called me at 8 o'clock with the news, his voice carrying the wearied tone of someone who had spent too many years dealing with family drama. "She's claiming emotional distress," he told me. "Undue influence, coercion, temporary insanity on your part due to grief. Her attorney is suggesting that no reasonable person would disinherit their child over a single mistake." A single mistake, I repeated. Is that what 32 years of selfishness has become? A single mistake. That's how they're framing it. They're also claiming that the timing of the will modification, so soon after Edmund's death, suggests you weren't in your right mind. I walked to the window of Edmund's study and looked out at the garden he had spent years perfecting. The autumn flowers were still blooming, defiant against the approaching winter, beautiful in their temporary glory. "James," I said calmly, "I want you to do something for me." "What's that?" "I want you to compile every bank statement, credit card bill, and financial record that shows money we gave to Sonia over the past decade. I want receipts for her wedding, documentation of the house down payment, records of the monthly allowance, everything." "Why?" "Because if she wants to claim this was about a single mistake, I'm going to show the court exactly how many mistakes we overlooked, how much money we spent enabling her behavior, and how many chances we gave her to become a decent human being." James was quiet for a moment. "Clara, that's going to be a substantial amount of documentation." "I know. We gave her everything, James. Everything. And this is how she chooses to repay that generosity, by suing the mother who spent 32 years sacrificing for her happiness. I'll get started on the compilation, James said. But, Clara, you should know that this is going to get ugly. Public legal battles always do, especially when there's this much money involved. It's already ugly, I replied. The only question now is whether it's going to be ugly with consequences or ugly without them. That afternoon, I drove to the cemetery to visit Edmund's grave. The flowers from the funeral were beginning to wilt, but the granite headstone looked exactly as it should, dignified, permanent, worthy of the man whose name it bore. I sat on the small bench I'd had installed nearby and told him about everything that had happened since the will reading. The viral social media posts, the news calls, Sonia's lawsuit, all of it poured out in a one-sided conversation with a man who could no longer offer advice or comfort. I think you'd be proud of me, I said finally. For the first time in our daughter's life, I'm not cleaning up her messes or making excuses for her behavior. She's facing real consequences and maybe, just maybe, she'll learn something from them. A cool breeze rustled through the maple trees overhead, dropping a few early autumn leaves onto Edmund's grave. I brushed them away gently, maintaining the neat appearance he would have insisted upon if he'd been there to see it. I miss you, I whispered. I miss your wisdom, your patience, your ability to see the best in people even when they disappointed you. But I can't be patient anymore, Edmund. I can't keep enabling her selfishness in the name of love. The sun was beginning to set as I walked back to my car, painting the cemetery in shades of gold and amber that reminded me of happier times. As I drove home, I passed the house where Sonia and Marcus lived, noting that the driveway was empty and the windows were dark. I wondered where they were, what they were planning, how they were processing the complete destruction of their financial expectations. Part of me, the mother who had spent 32 years worrying about her daughter's well-being, wanted to call and check on them, to offer comfort and reassurance that this situation could somehow be resolved. But a larger part of me, the part that had finally learned the difference between love and enabling, understood that Sonia needed to sit with the consequences of her choices. She needed to understand what it felt like to have nothing handed to her, to face a future that wasn't automatically secured by her parents' success. She needed to discover who she was when she couldn't rely on anyone else's money or influence or connections to smooth her path through life. It was a lesson that was 32 years overdue, and I wasn't going to interfere with her education now. As I pulled into my own driveway, I noticed a car I didn't recognize parked across the street. A young woman with a notebook and camera sat behind the wheel, clearly hoping to catch a glimpse of the mother who had become an overnight internet sensation. I walked to my front door with my head held high, my steps measured and dignified. If the world wanted to watch me navigate this situation, they would see a woman who was comfortable with her choices, who had finally learned to put principles before popularity. Inside the house, I poured myself a glass of Edmund's best whiskey and toasted his portrait. To lessons learned, I said aloud, and to the courage to let them be learned the hard way. The whiskey burned going down, but it was a good burn, the kind that reminded you that you were still alive, still capable of making difficult decisions, still strong enough to withstand whatever consequences those decisions might bring. For the first time since Edmund's diagnosis, I felt genuinely hopeful about the future. 3 months after the will reading, I sat in a courtroom watching my daughter testify about what a terrible mother I had been. She looked beautiful, of course. Sonia had always understood the power of appearance, and her legal team had clearly coached her on how to present herself as a sympathetic victim. She wore a navy blue dress that suggested both respectability and mourning. Her makeup was subtle enough to look natural while still being camera-ready, and her voice carried just the right amount of wounded vulnerability. "My mother has always been controlling," she told the judge, her words carefully measured for maximum impact. Even as a child, I felt like I could never live up to her impossibly high standards. Nothing I did was ever good enough. I sat at the defendant's table next to James, maintaining the kind of composed expression I'd perfected during 35 years of society functions. But inside, I was taking careful notes on every lie, every manipulation, every attempt to rewrite the history of our relationship. Can you give the court an example of this controlling behavior? Sonia's attorney asked. He was young and ambitious, the kind of lawyer who probably saw this case as his ticket to bigger things. Sonia dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. Real tears, I noticed, though whether they came from genuine emotion or strategic calculation was anyone's guess. When I was in college, she said, her voice trembling slightly, I wanted to study art history because it was my passion. But my mother insisted I major in business because it was more practical. When I tried to follow my dreams, she threatened to cut off my tuition payments. The lie was so smooth, so perfectly delivered, that I almost admired her skill. The truth, of course, was that Sonia had changed majors 6 times in 4 years, dropping out of each program the moment it required actual effort or commitment. We had never insisted she study business. We had only asked that she finish something, anything, rather than treating college like an expensive social club. And this pattern of control continued into your adult life? The attorney prompted. Constantly, Sonia replied. She criticized my husband, my friends, my choices. She made it clear that her financial support came with strings attached, that I had to live my life according to her rules if I wanted to remain part of the family. Another lie, beautifully crafted. The truth was that Edmund and I had supported Sonia's choices even when they disappointed us, had welcomed Marcus into the family despite our private concerns about his character, had continued providing financial assistance even when we knew it was enabling rather than helping. Now, regarding your father's funeral, the attorney continued, and I saw Sonia's composure waver slightly. This was the difficult part, the event that couldn't be reframed or explained away quite as easily. That was a miscommunication, Sonia said carefully. I was told the funeral was on Sunday, not Saturday. By the time I realized my mistake, it was too late to attend. I leaned over to James and whispered, "Check her phone records. I want documentation of every call, text, and email regarding the funeral arrangements." James nodded and made a note. We both knew this was another lie. The funeral information had been shared repeatedly with Sonia through multiple channels, and her Instagram posts from Marcus's party proved she had known exactly what she was choosing to do. And when you learned of your mother's decision to modify your inheritance, the attorney continued, how did that make you feel? Devastated, Sonia said, and for the first time, I heard something that might have been genuine emotion in her voice. Not because of the money, but because it felt like she was erasing me from the family. Like 32 years of being her daughter meant nothing. The money comment was laughable. Of course it was about the money. It had always been about the money with Sonia. But the pain in her voice when she talked about being erased from the family, that felt real. And despite everything, despite all the lies and manipulation and years of disappointment, that pain still had the power to hurt me. Your witness, Sonia's attorney said, settling back into his chair with the satisfied expression of someone who believed he had just delivered a knockout blow. James stood slowly, his gray hair and formal bearing giving him the kind of gravitas that comes from 40 years of courtroom experience. He approached Sonia with the careful respect due to someone's daughter, but his voice carried steel when he spoke. Ms. Henderson, he began, you testified that your mother was controlling and that her financial support came with unreasonable strings attached. Is that correct? Yes, Sonia replied, her chin lifting slightly in defiance. And yet, despite this alleged controlling behavior, your parents provided you with a private school education that cost them over $200,000. Is that correct? Yes, but they paid for your college education, including the costs associated with your multiple changes of major, totaling approximately $300,000? Sonia's attorney objected, but the judge allowed the question. Yes, Sonia admitted, her voice quieter now. They provided the down payment for your current home, a sum of $400,000? Yes. They paid for your wedding, which cost approximately $200,000? Yes. They provided you with a monthly allowance of $5,000 for the past 3 years, totaling $180,000? Yes, but that was... And they continued this support even after you dropped out of graduate school, even after you quit 3 different jobs, even after you announced you were taking a year off to find yourself, a year that turned into 3 years of no employment whatsoever? Objection, Sonia's attorney called. Argumentative. Sustained, the judge said, but the damage was done. The courtroom was quiet except for the scratching of pencils as reporters took notes. Ms. Henderson, James continued, you testified that you missed your father's funeral due to a miscommunication about the date. Is that your testimony? Yes. James walked to the evidence table and picked up a manila folder. I'd like to enter into evidence the defendant's phone records showing 17 text messages, 9 phone calls, and 4 emails regarding the funeral arrangements, all received between the time of your father's death and the time of the service. Sonia's face went pale. There were a lot of messages I might have missed. I'd also like to enter into evidence these screenshots from your Instagram account showing posts from your husband's birthday party with timestamps indicating they were published during your father's funeral service. The courtroom was so quiet I could hear the air conditioning humming. Sonia stared at the evidence as if she could make it disappear through sheer force of will. Ms. Henderson, James said, his voice gentle but relentless, were you at your husband's birthday party while your family was burying your father? A long pause. Yes. And you chose to attend that party instead of the funeral? It was complicated. Was it complicated because the party was more fun than a funeral? Objection. Sustained. But again, the damage was done. Everyone in the courtroom, the judge, the jury, the reporters, the spectators, could see the truth of what had happened. Sonia had chosen a party over her father's funeral, and no amount of legal maneuvering could change that basic fact. James spent the next hour methodically destroying every aspect of Sonia's testimony, using bank records and documented evidence to show the pattern of generosity and enabling that had characterized her relationship with her parents. By the time he was finished, Sonia looked exhausted and defeated, her carefully constructed narrative reduced to rubble. No further questions, James said, returning to our table. I looked across the courtroom at my daughter, noting the way she couldn't meet my eyes, the defeated slump of her shoulders, the reality of her situation finally beginning to sink in. She had come to court expecting sympathy and vindication. Instead, she had been forced to confront the truth about her own behavior in the most public way possible. The judge called for a recess, and as the courtroom emptied, I remained in my seat, thinking about the path that had brought us to this moment. 32 years of unconditional love and support, culminating in a legal battle where mother and daughter faced each other as adversaries. How do you think it's going? I asked James as he packed up his files. Better than expected, he replied. Her testimony was exactly what we needed. It revealed her character more clearly than any evidence we could have presented. I nodded, but I felt no satisfaction in the moment. This wasn't a victory I had wanted to win. It was simply a consequence I had finally become strong enough to allow. As I walked out of the courtroom, I caught sight of Sonia and Marcus huddled with their attorney near the elevators. She looked smaller somehow, diminished by the experience of having her lies exposed in such a public forum. For just a moment, I felt the old maternal impulse to go to her, to offer comfort and reassurance, to try to fix whatever was broken between us. But then I remembered the Instagram posts, the casual cruelty of her choices, the 32 years of taking everything for granted. I remembered that some lessons can only be learned through pain, and some consequences can't be avoided forever. I walked past them without a word, my head held high, my conscience clear. The truth had been told. Justice would follow. The judge's decision came down 3 weeks later, on a gray December morning that felt appropriate for endings. I sat in the same courtroom where Sonia had testified about my alleged failings as a mother, surrounded by the same cast of characters who had watched our family drama play out in the most public way possible. The media interest had only intensified during the weeks of testimony. This story had everything journalists loved: money, family drama, generational conflict, and a protagonist who was either a vindictive monster or a mother who had finally found her backbone. Judge Patricia Harrison was a woman in her 60s who had built her career on family law, someone who had seen every variation of human selfishness and generosity that family money could produce. She looked tired as she took her seat, as if the weight of deciding between a mother and daughter had aged her during the brief deliberation period. This court has carefully reviewed all testimony and evidence presented in the matter of Henderson versus Orem, she began, her voice carrying the formal gravity that marked the end of legal proceedings. The plaintiff has alleged that the defendant acted under emotional distress and undue influence when she modified the deceased's will, and has requested that this modification be overturned and the original inheritance restored. Sonia sat ramrod straight in her chair, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had gone white. She had dressed more conservatively today, a black dress that spoke of mourning rather than celebration, minimal makeup that allowed her natural beauty to show through without seeming calculated. It was, I realized, the first time in years that I had seen her look genuinely vulnerable rather than strategically crafted. The court finds, Judge Harrison continued, that the evidence presented supports the defendant's position that her actions were taken rationally and with full consideration of the circumstances leading to her decision. I felt James relax slightly beside me, but I remained motionless. I had learned not to celebrate too early, not to assume that justice and law always aligned perfectly. The testimony and evidence clearly establish a pattern of financial support provided by the deceased and his wife over a period of more than 30 years, totaling approximately $1.3 million in direct payments, gifts, and support. This support was provided without legal obligation and continued despite repeated instances of behavior that might reasonably be considered disrespectful or ungrateful. The judge's voice was clinical, but each word landed like a physical blow. I could see Sonia flinch as the full scope of our generosity was laid out in legal terms, as if hearing it from an impartial authority made it real in a way that private family conversations never had. The court further finds that the plaintiff's absence from her father's funeral, while attending a social celebration, represents a level of disrespect that would justify any reasonable person reconsidering their relationship with the plaintiff. Sonia's attorney shifted uncomfortably in his chair. This was not the direction he had hoped the verdict would take. The modification of the will was made by the defendant in her legal capacity as executor, using authority explicitly granted to her by the deceased. The decision was made with full legal capacity and clear understanding of the consequences. There is no evidence of coercion, undue influence, or diminished mental capacity. I allowed myself a small breath of relief. The legal foundation was solid, the decision was being upheld. But I knew the real judgment was still coming, the part where the judge would either validate my choice or condemn it. However, Judge Harrison continued, and I felt my stomach clench. This court cannot ignore the profound sadness of a family relationship deteriorated to this point. The plaintiff is clearly a young woman who has never learned the value of gratitude, responsibility, or respect for family obligations. The defendant is a mother who found herself with no remaining tools to teach these lessons except the removal of financial support. The judge paused, looking directly at Sonia with an expression that mixed disappointment with something that might have been pity. The court finds that the plaintiff's behavior, choosing to attend a social celebration rather than her father's funeral, represents such a fundamental failure of character and family loyalty that no reasonable person could be expected to continue providing financial support without question. Sonia's face crumpled. Not the strategic tears she had deployed during her testimony, but the real, ugly crying of someone whose carefully constructed world was collapsing around her. The motion to overturn the will modification is denied, Judge Harrison said with finality. The defendant's actions were legally sound and morally justified. The plaintiff will receive exactly what the modified will stipulates, $1, along with whatever lessons she may choose to learn from this experience. The gavel came down with a sound like a door slamming shut. Sonia's attorney was already whispering urgently in her ear about appeals and next steps, but I could see in her face that the fight had gone out of her. This public dissection of her character, this legal validation of my decision, had accomplished what 32 years of private conversations had failed to do. She finally understood that actions have consequences, and some consequences can't be appealed. As the courtroom emptied, I remained in my seat, processing what had just happened. The legal battle was over, but the family relationship, what remained of it, would need to be rebuilt from the ground up, if it could be rebuilt at all. James was gathering his papers with the satisfied efficiency of a lawyer who had just won a case he believed in. "Well," he said quietly, "that went as well as we could have hoped." "Did it?" I asked. "I've just legally humiliated my own daughter in front of the entire city. I'm not sure that constitutes winning." "You taught her a lesson that no one else was willing to teach," James replied. "Sometimes that's what love looks like." I watched as Sonia and Marcus made their way toward the exit, her face hidden behind sunglasses that couldn't quite conceal the devastation of public defeat. For a moment, our eyes met across the courtroom, and I saw something I hadn't seen in years: genuine remorse. Not regret about the money, though I was sure she felt that too, but something deeper. Shame, perhaps, or the beginning recognition of how far she had fallen from the woman her father and I had hoped she would become. "Clara?" I turned to find Margaret standing beside my chair, her face creased with concern and something that looked like admiration. "How do you feel?" she asked. I considered the question carefully. How did I feel? Victorious? Vindicated? Satisfied that justice had been served? Empty, I said finally. Necessary, but empty. Margaret squeezed my hand. You did the right thing. It was hard, but it was right. As we walked out of the courthouse together, I was surprised to find a small crowd of reporters waiting on the steps. Cameras flashed and microphones were thrust in my direction, voices calling out questions about my feelings, my relationship with Sonia, my plans for the future. I stopped at the top of the courthouse steps and looked out over the crowd of journalists and curious onlookers who had gathered to witness the conclusion of our family drama. "Mrs. Oram," one reporter called out, "how do you feel about the judge's decision?" I thought about giving them the standard non-answer that people in my position usually offered, but something about the moment, the finality of it, the public nature of what we had just endured, made me want to speak honestly. I feel, I said clearly, my voice carrying across the courthouse steps, like a mother who finally found the courage to stop enabling her daughter's worst impulses. I feel like a woman who honored her husband's memory by refusing to reward behavior that would have broken his heart. "Do you have any regrets?" another reporter shouted. "I regret that it took me 32 years to learn this lesson," I replied. "I regret that my husband didn't live to see his daughter finally held accountable for her choices. But I don't regret my decision. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is let them experience the consequences of their actions." What would you say to other parents dealing with entitled adult children? I paused, thinking about all the parents who had reached out to me during the media coverage of our case, sharing their own stories of children who took everything for granted and gave nothing back. I would say that love without boundaries isn't love, it's enabling. And enabling someone doesn't help them grow, it helps them stay weak. If you want your children to become strong, independent, responsible adults, you have to be willing to let them fail. You have to be willing to say no, even when it breaks your heart. Have you spoken to your daughter since the verdict? No, I said simply. But my door is open. For a daughter who has learned the value of respect, gratitude, and family loyalty. Not for someone who expects inheritance without accountability. As I walked down the courthouse steps toward my car, I felt lighter than I had in months. The legal battle was over, the principle had been established, and the world now knew that Clara Oram was a woman who kept her word. Whether Sonia would learn from this experience remained to be seen. But for the first time in years, her education was no longer my responsibility. She was 32 years old. It was time for her to teach herself. 6 months after the court verdict, I was tending to Edmund's roses when I saw the car pull into my driveway. It was a modest sedan, several years old, the kind of vehicle that spoke of careful budgeting rather than casual extravagance. I recognized it as belonging to my neighbor's daughter, and I wondered for a moment why she might be visiting on a Saturday afternoon. Then the passenger door opened, and Sonia stepped out. She looked different, thinner, older somehow, wearing jeans and a simple sweater instead of the designer clothes that had once been her uniform. Her hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her face bore no trace of the elaborate makeup that had once required hours to apply. This was not the woman who had stormed out of my house 6 months ago, promising revenge and eternal resentment. This was someone I barely recognized, someone who looked like she had been forced to confront reality in ways that had fundamentally changed her. I remained kneeling beside the rose bushes, my gardening gloves dirty from the soil, watching as Sonia walked slowly up the pathway to my front door. She moved hesitantly, as if she wasn't sure she had the right to be there, as if she expected to be turned away at any moment. When she reached the garden where I was working, she stopped and waited. Not demanding my attention, not announcing her presence, just waiting. "Hello, Sonia," I said finally, not looking up from the roses that Edmund had planted during our first spring in this house. "Hello, Mother." Her voice was quieter than I remembered, stripped of the entitled confidence that had once characterized every conversation. I continued pruning, giving my hands something to do, while my mind processed this unexpected development. "These roses were your father's pride and joy," I said. "He spent hours out here every weekend, making sure they had everything they needed to bloom." "I remember," Sonia said softly. "He used to cut bouquets for you every Friday during the growing season." "Yes." He understood that beautiful things require consistent care and attention. That neglect shows up eventually, no matter how strong the original foundation. We stood in silence for several minutes, the metaphor hanging in the air between us like a bridge that neither of us was quite ready to cross. "I've been working," Sonia said finally. I looked up at her then, noting the way her hands showed signs of actual labor, the way her skin had lost the pampered softness that expensive creams and spa treatments had maintained for years. "Oh, at a hotel downtown. Housekeeping." She said it without shame, which surprised me. The old Sonia would have been mortified to admit to manual labor, would have found a way to make it sound temporary or beneath her station. "How long?" "4 months. Since Marcus and since we separated." This was news. I had wondered how their marriage would survive the complete evaporation of Sonia's financial expectations, but I hadn't allowed myself to hope that she might finally see Marcus for what he was. "I see. He filed for divorce the week after the court decision," Sonia continued, her voice matter-of-fact rather than bitter. "Said he couldn't be married to someone who was financially unstable." His exact words. I felt a flicker of the old maternal protectiveness, the instinct to comfort my daughter in her pain. But I suppressed it, waiting to see where this conversation was leading. "I'm sorry to hear that," I said neutrally. I'm not. Sonia's voice was stronger now, more certain. You were right about him, Mother. He never loved me. He loved what he thought I could provide for him. When that disappeared, so did he. She sat down on the stone bench Edmund had installed near the rose garden, folding her hands in her lap like a schoolgirl waiting for instruction. I've had a lot of time to think these past few months, she said. About choices I've made, about the person I became, about Daddy's funeral. My hands stilled on the roses. This was the conversation I had been both dreading and hoping for since the day I changed her inheritance. And what conclusions have you reached? I asked. Sonia was quiet for a long moment, staring at her hands as if the words she needed might be written on her palms. I was selfish, she said finally. Not just that day, but for years. Decades. I took everything you and Daddy gave me and never once asked what I could give back. I treated your love like it was unlimited, like there were no consequences for how badly I behaved. I continued working with the roses, afraid that if I stopped, if I looked at her directly, I might cry or reach for her, or do something that would interrupt this moment of clarity she seemed to be having. I chose a party over Daddy's funeral, she continued, her voice growing thick with emotion. I chose champagne and celebration over honoring the man who made my entire life possible. I can't even explain why I did that, except that I had become someone who thought everything revolved around my happiness, my convenience, my desires. A tear fell onto her hands, and she wiped it away impatiently. The worst part is that I knew better. You and Daddy raised me to know better. I just chose to ignore everything you taught me because it was easier to be selfish than to be responsible. I finally looked up at her, seeing my daughter clearly for perhaps the first time in years. Not the entitled woman-child who had dominated our relationship for so long, but the person she might have been if I had been stronger, if I had insisted on accountability instead of accepting excuses. What do you want from me, Sonia? I asked gently. Nothing, she said, and the simplicity of the answer caught me off guard. I don't want anything from you, Mother. I came here to give you something. She reached into her purse and pulled out a crumpled dollar bill. The same one she had thrown on the floor during the will reading, the one that had symbolized her complete fall from grace. I want to give this back to you, she said, holding it out with hands that trembled slightly. Not because I don't want it, but because I finally understand what it means. It means that everything I have should be something I've earned, not something I've been given. I stared at the dollar bill, remembering the day I had included it in Edmund's will, the symbolic weight I had intended it to carry. I also want to apologize, Sonia continued. Not because I think it will change anything between us, but because you deserve to hear it. I'm sorry for missing Daddy's funeral. I'm sorry for 32 years of taking your love for granted. I'm sorry for becoming someone who is more concerned with parties than with family. I'm sorry for embarrassing you in court and in the media. And I'm sorry it took losing everything for me to finally understand what I had thrown away. The garden was quiet except for the sound of birds in the trees Edmund had planted, the distant hum of traffic from the city he had helped build. I don't expect forgiveness, Sonia said. I don't expect to be welcomed back into the family as if nothing happened. I understand that trust, once broken, has to be rebuilt slowly, if it can be rebuilt at all. But I wanted you to know that I finally understand why you did what you did. And I wanted to thank you for loving me enough to let me fail. She stood up from the bench, smoothing her simple sweater with hands that looked older than her 32 years. I should go, she said. I needed you to know that I'm trying to become someone Daddy would be proud of. Someone you could be proud of. It might take years, it might take decades, but I'm going to keep trying. I watched her walk toward the car, noting the dignity in her posture despite everything she had lost, the quiet strength that seemed to have emerged from the ashes of her former life. Sonia, I called out when she reached the driveway. She turned back, hope flickering in her eyes for the first time since she had arrived. Your father would be proud of the woman who just spoke to me, I said. And so am I. The smile that crossed her face was radiant and heartbreaking, the expression of someone who had forgotten what approval felt like and was surprised to discover it still mattered. Thank you, Mother, she said softly. That means everything to me. As the car pulled away, I remained in the garden, holding the crumpled dollar bill and thinking about second chances, about the possibility of redemption, about the difference between enabling someone and empowering them to change. For the first time in months, I felt genuinely hopeful about my daughter's future. Not because she had apologized, but because she had done so without expecting anything in return. Not because she had acknowledged her mistakes, but because she seemed determined to learn from them. The dollar bill was wrinkled and worn, but it was still legal tender. Still valuable, despite everything it had been through. Much like the relationship between a mother and daughter who had finally learned that love without accountability wasn't love at all. It was just another form of selfishness, wrapped in pretty paper and tied with good intentions. I folded the dollar bill carefully and put it in my pocket, next to my heart, where it would stay as a reminder that sometimes the most precious gifts are the ones that cost everything to give and everything to receive. 2 years had passed since Sonia's visit to my garden, and the world had shifted in ways I couldn't have anticipated. I was sitting in my study, reviewing the quarterly reports from the various investments Edmund's business had been folded into, when my phone rang with a number I now recognized immediately. Hello, Mother. Sonia's voice carried a warmth that still surprised me, even after 24 months of weekly phone calls that had slowly rebuilt the bridge between us. Hello, sweetheart. How was your week? Good. Busy. I got promoted to head of housekeeping at the hotel. I smiled, hearing the genuine pride in her voice. The woman who had once viewed manual labor as beneath her dignity now spoke about her work with the kind of satisfaction that comes from earning something through merit rather than inheritance. Congratulations. Your father would be so proud. I hope so. A pause. Mother, I have something I want to tell you. My heart clenched slightly. Over the past 2 years, I had learned to treasure these conversations, to look forward to them in ways that reminded me of the early days of Sonia's childhood, when she would call from school to share the small triumphs and disappointments of her day.
I'm listening.
I've been saving money, every month, putting aside what I can from my salary. And I want to buy something. Oh, what's that? A headstone flower arrangement for Daddy's grave. Something permanent, something beautiful. I know you've been maintaining the flowers there, and I appreciate it more than I can say, but I want to contribute. I want to show him that I'm finally the daughter he deserved. The words hit me like a physical blow, but it was a good kind of pain, the kind that comes from healing rather than injury. Sonia, I said softly, you don't need to. Yes, I do, she interrupted, her voice firm but not argumentative. I need to do this, Mother. I need to contribute something to his memory that comes from my own work, my own sacrifice. I've spent 2 years learning what it means to earn something, and this feels like the right way to honor both of you. I closed my eyes, remembering all the conversations Edmund and I had had about our daughter, all the hopes and fears we had shared about the woman she might become. He would love that, I said finally. And so do I. There's something else, Sonia continued, and I could hear a different quality in her voice now. Nervousness, perhaps, or excitement. What's that? I met someone. At work. Another employee, he's in maintenance, fixing things when they break. His name is David, and he's different from anyone I've ever dated. My first instinct was maternal worry. After the disaster with Marcus, I wanted to protect my daughter from making another poor choice in men. But I caught myself, recognizing that this protective impulse was exactly the kind of thinking that had enabled Sonia's poor decisions for so many years. Tell me about him, I said instead. He's kind, Sonia said, and the simplicity of the statement spoke volumes. Really kind, in ways that don't cost anything or benefit him directly. He helps elderly guests with their luggage even though it's not his job. He stays late to finish repairs, so the next shift doesn't have to deal with broken equipment. He treats everyone, guests, co-workers, management, with the same respect. She paused, and when she continued, her voice was softer. He doesn't know about who I used to be, about the money or the court case or any of it. He just knows me as Sonia, the woman who works hard and saves her money and tries to be useful. And he likes that person. He likes who I am now, not who I was or what I might be able to provide for him. I felt tears prick at my eyes, hearing the wonder in my daughter's voice as she described being valued for her character rather than her inheritance. That sounds wonderful, sweetheart. I'm scared, she admitted. Scared that I'll mess it up somehow, that I'll revert to my old habits and drive him away. Scared that I don't deserve someone that good. You deserve happiness, Sonia. You've worked hard to become someone who can appreciate and reciprocate genuine kindness. Don't let fear rob you of something beautiful. We talked for another hour about her job, her new relationship, her plans for the future. She was considering taking night classes to learn hotel management, thinking about building a career in hospitality. She spoke about wanting to own a small bed and breakfast someday to create a place where people felt welcomed and cared for. It was the first time in years that I had heard her talk about future goals that involved serving others rather than serving herself. After we hung up, I sat in Edmund's study looking at his portrait, imagining what he would think of the woman our daughter was becoming. She's finding her way, I told his image. Finally, after all these years, she's finding her way back to the values we tried to teach her. A week later, I drove to the cemetery to visit Edmund's grave, as I did every Sunday afternoon. The autumn flowers I had planted were beginning to fade, preparing for winter dormancy, but they still added color to the peaceful hillside where my husband rested. I was surprised to find that I wasn't alone. Sonia knelt beside the headstone, carefully arranging a spray of white lilies, Edmund's favorite flowers, in a bronze vase that gleamed in the afternoon sunlight. She wore simple clothes and no makeup, her hair pulled back in a practical style that spoke of someone who had learned to value substance over appearance. She looked up when she heard my footsteps, her face lighting up with the kind of genuine smile that had been missing from her expression for so many years. Mother, I wasn't expecting you today. I come every Sunday, I said, settling onto the small bench I had installed nearby. This is a pleasant surprise. I wanted to bring these myself, she said, gesturing to the flowers. I saved for 3 months to buy the arrangement and I wanted to place it personally, to tell Daddy that I'm sorry and that I'm trying to become someone he could be proud of. We sat together in comfortable silence, two women who had learned to appreciate each other's company after years of misunderstanding and disappointment. There's something I want you to know, I said finally. Sonia looked at me with a kind of attentive respect that the old Sonia had never shown, genuine interest in what another person had to say, rather than impatience to return the conversation to herself. I've been thinking about the inheritance, I continued. Sonia's expression didn't change, but I saw her hands tighten slightly in her lap. Mother, I told you, I don't want anything. I don't expect anything. I'm grateful just to have you back in my life. I know you are. And that's exactly why I've been thinking about it. I reached into my purse and withdrew a legal document that James had prepared the week before. This is a new will, I said. One that reflects the woman you've become rather than the woman you used to be. Sonia's eyes widened. I don't understand. You will inherit everything, Sonia. The house, the investments, the remainder of your father's business interests. But not immediately. I handed her the document, watching as she read the terms I had carefully considered. You'll receive your full inheritance on your 40th birthday, I explained, provided you continue to demonstrate the character and values you've developed over the past 2 years. Employment, responsibility, healthy relationships, respect for family obligations, all of it documented and verified. Sonia looked up from the papers, tears streaming down her face. Mother, I can't. You can and you will, I said firmly. Because you've proven that you understand the difference between inheriting money and earning the right to inherit it. You've shown me that you can work for what you want, that you can value relationships over financial gain, that you can think about others before yourself. What if I fail? What if I disappoint you again? I reached over and took her hands in mine, noting the calluses that spoke of honest work, the strength that came from learning to rely on herself. Then we'll deal with that when it happens, I said. But I don't think you'll fail, sweetheart. I think you've finally learned who you really are, and that person is strong enough to handle whatever challenges come her way. Sonia threw her arms around me then, holding me tight while she cried tears that seemed to wash away years of regret and disappointment. Thank you, she whispered against my shoulder, for not giving up on me, for loving me enough to let me fall, for believing I could become someone better. That's what mothers do, I said, stroking her hair the way I had when she was small. We love you enough to let you learn, even when it breaks our hearts to watch. As we sat beside Edmund's grave, holding each other and watching the sun set over the city he had helped build, I felt a peace I hadn't experienced since his death. Our family was broken for so many years, but it was finally healing, not through forgiveness without accountability, but through the hard work of change and growth and genuine remorse. The woman sitting beside me was not the daughter I had raised, but she was the daughter I had always hoped she would become. It had taken losing everything for her to find herself, but perhaps that was the only way it could have happened. Sometimes the most valuable inheritances are the ones that can't be measured in dollars, the inheritance of character, of values, of the knowledge that love combined with boundaries can create something stronger than either could accomplish alone. Edmund would be proud of both of us, I thought. The mother who had finally learned to say no, and the daughter who had finally learned to say thank you. 5 years had passed since that December morning when a judge had validated my decision to disinherit my daughter. Today, I stood in the same courthouse, but this time the circumstances were entirely different. At 37, Sonia looked radiant in a simple blue dress that brought out her eyes that now held the warmth and wisdom that come from genuine adversity overcome. Beside her stood David, the maintenance worker who had become her husband 2 years earlier in a ceremony that had been everything her first wedding wasn't: intimate, meaningful, and focused on love rather than spectacle. They had come to court today for a very different reason than our last legal encounter. Today, they were finalizing the adoption of a little girl named Emma, a 6-year-old who had been in foster care since her birth parents had lost custody due to addiction and neglect. I watched from the gallery as Sonia knelt to Emma's eye level, smoothing the child's dark hair and whispering reassurances about their new life together. The tenderness in the gesture, the genuine love in her voice, spoke to the profound changes my daughter had undergone. Mrs. Oram? I turned to find Judge Harrison, the same judge who had presided over our inheritance case, standing beside me in the hallway outside the courtroom. Judge Harrison, what a surprise to see you here. I remember your case, she said with a slight smile. It's not often that family court decisions have such dramatic outcomes. I've been following the news coverage of your daughter's transformation with interest. She's become everything her father and I hoped she would be, I said. It just took longer and required more drastic measures than we anticipated. Judge Harrison nodded thoughtfully. Sometimes the kindest thing we can do for someone is refuse to enable their worst impulses. It appears your daughter learned that lesson well. Through the courthouse windows, I could see news crews setting up on the front steps. Sonia's story had captured public attention again, but this time for reasons that filled me with pride rather than embarrassment. the $1 heiress, had become something of a folk hero, a cautionary tale about entitlement that had transformed into an inspiring story about redemption. "How does it feel?" Judge Harrison asked, "seeing her like this?" I considered the question, watching through the courtroom doors as Sonia and David signed the final adoption papers that would make Emma legally their daughter. "Vindicated," I said finally, not because I was right to disinherit her, but because she proved that the woman I always believed she could be was still there, underneath all the selfishness and entitlement. She just needed to lose everything to find herself. The judge moved on to other business, but I remained in the hallway, thinking about the journey that had brought us to this moment. The years of enabling, the painful decision to cut Sonia off, the public humiliation of the court case, the slow rebuilding of trust and respect, all of it had led to this afternoon when my daughter would become a mother herself. When the adoption proceeding concluded, the new family emerged from the courtroom with Emma between them, all three holding hands and beaming with joy. The little girl looked up at Sonia with a kind of trust and adoration that only children can offer, and I saw my daughter's face transform with the realization of what she had just committed to. "Congratulations," I said, approaching them with the careful formality that still characterized our relationship, even after years of reconciliation. "Thank you, Mother," Sonia said, and I heard the multiple layers of meaning in those simple words. "Thanks for being here today. Thanks for supporting this decision. Thanks for believing I could become someone worthy of this responsibility." "Hello, Emma," I said, kneeling to the little girl's level. "I'm Sonia's mother, which makes me your new grandmother." Emma studied me with the serious expression of a child who had learned early to be cautious about adult promises. "Are you nice?" she asked directly. I laughed, the first genuine laugh I'd had in months. "I try to be. But I'm also fair, which means I believe in consequences for actions and rewards for good behavior. I think we'll get along just fine." Emma nodded solemnly, apparently satisfied with this explanation. As we walked down the courthouse steps together, reporters called out questions about Sonia's transformation, about our relationship, about the lessons learned from our very public family drama. "Mrs. Oram," one journalist shouted, "how do you feel about your daughter's adoption today?" I paused at the top of the steps, looking out over the crowd of cameras and microphones. 5 years ago, I had stood in almost this exact spot and declared that love without boundaries wasn't love at all. Today, I had something different to say. "I feel proud," I said clearly. "Proud of the woman my daughter has become, proud of the man she chose to marry, and proud that they've decided to give a child the kind of loving, stable home that every child deserves." "Do you regret your decision to disinherit her?" "No," I said without hesitation. "I regret that it was necessary, but I don't regret the decision itself. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is refuse to participate in their self-destruction." Sonia needed to learn that privilege comes with responsibility, that love requires reciprocity, and that character can't be inherited. It has to be earned. What would you say to other parents dealing with entitled adult children? I looked at Sonia, who was helping Emma navigate the courthouse steps with patient care, then back at the crowd of reporters. I would say that enabling someone's bad behavior doesn't help them. It helps them stay weak. If you truly love your children, you'll insist they develop the strength to stand on their own. You'll teach them that actions have consequences, that respect must be earned, and that the world doesn't owe them anything simply because they exist. And what would you say to children who feel entitled to their parents' wealth? I would say that inheritance is a privilege, not a right, and privileges can be revoked when they're not appreciated. If you want to inherit your parents' legacy, start by inheriting their values. Learn to work, learn to give, learn to put others before yourself. Money is meaningless without character to guide how it's used. As we reached the sidewalk, Emma tugged on my sleeve. "Grandma Clara?" The title caught me off guard, We hadn't discussed what she would call me, and hearing it for the first time filled me with unexpected emotion. Yes, sweetheart. Mommy Sonia says you're very wise. Can you teach me to be wise too? I looked down at this little girl who had already survived more hardship than any child should face, who was now part of our complicated, imperfect, but ultimately loving family. I can teach you what I've learned, I said. But wisdom isn't something you can give someone. It's something they have to earn through their own experiences, their own mistakes, their own growth. Emma nodded as if this made perfect sense. Like how Mommy Sonia had to learn to be good? The simplicity of the statement, the clarity of a child's understanding, brought tears to my eyes. Exactly like that, I said. That evening, we gathered at my house for a quiet family dinner, the first time in 5 years that Sonia had been inside the home where she'd grown up. The dining room where I had delivered her inheritance looked different now, warmer somehow, filled with the laughter of a child and the comfortable conversation of adults who had learned to respect each other. Emma was fascinated by the photographs covering the walls, pictures of Edmund and me, of Sonia as a child, of family celebrations from happier times. She studied each image with intense curiosity, asking questions about the people and occasions captured in the frames. "Who's that man?" she asked, pointing to Edmund's portrait above the fireplace. "That's your new grandfather," Sonia said softly. "He died before you could meet him, but he was a wonderful man who would have loved you very much." "Where did he go when he died?" I watched Sonia handle this question with a kind of thoughtful care that the old Sonia would never have possessed. "Well, different people believe different things about what happens after we die," she said. "But I believe he's still with us in some way, watching over our family and making sure we take care of each other." Emma seemed satisfied with this explanation. She moved on to other photographs, other questions, other discoveries about her new family's history. After dinner, while David helped Emma with a puzzle in the living room, Sonia and I cleaned dishes in the kitchen where I had spent so many years cooking meals that went unappreciated, planning celebrations that were taken for granted. "Mother," Sonia said quietly as she dried a plate, "I want you to know that I understand now why you did what you did. All of it. The will, the public humiliation, the years of refusing to bail me out when things got difficult." I continued washing, letting her talk. "I needed to lose everything to understand what I actually had," she continued. "I needed to face the consequences of my choices to learn how to make better ones. I needed to discover who I was when I couldn't rely on anyone else's money or influence or connections." She set down the dish towel and turned to face me. "I'm a better mother to Emma because you were strong enough to stop being an enabling mother to me. She's going to grow up understanding that love comes with expectations, that privilege comes with responsibility, that family loyalty goes both ways." I dried my hands and looked at my daughter, really looked at her, seeing not the selfish woman-child who had dominated our relationship for so many years, but the mature, thoughtful, genuinely caring person she had become. "Your father would be so proud of who you are now," I said. "And so am I." "I have something for you. Edmund's will is comprehensive and detailed," James continued, reflecting the careful thought he put into providing for his family and supporting the causes that were important to him during his lifetime. He opened the legal portfolio and withdrew several documents, arranging them carefully on the table before him like a dealer preparing for a high-stakes poker game. "Edmund begins with a personal message," James said, clearing his throat. "He wanted me to read this aloud to all of you." The room fell silent except for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner, the same clock that Edmund had bought when his company landed its first major contract, the one that had chimed through 35 years of family dinners and celebrations. "My dear family and friends," James read in his formal attorney voice, "if you are hearing these words, then I have gone ahead of you to whatever comes next. I want you to know that I faced that journey without fear, secure in the knowledge that I lived a life filled with love, purpose, and the deep satisfaction that comes from building something meaningful. I watched Sonia's face as James read, noting the way her expression softened into something that almost looked like genuine emotion. For a moment, she looked like the little girl I remembered, the one who used to climb into Edmund's lap to hear bedtime stories about brave princesses and wise queens. I have been blessed beyond measure, the reading continued, with a wife who stood beside me through every challenge and celebrated every victory, with friends who enriched my life immeasurably, and with the opportunity to create something lasting in this world. James paused to take a sip of water, and I could see Sonia lean forward slightly in her chair, anticipation bright in her dark eyes. Now, regarding the distribution of my earthly possessions, James continued, I have given considerable thought to how best to honor the relationships and values that have shaped my life. The room was so quiet I could hear people breathing. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for, the reason we were all gathered around this table on a Saturday afternoon instead of pursuing our own lives and interests. To my beloved wife, Clara, James read, I leave the house we shared, all personal property contained therein, my life insurance policy, and the entirety of my business interests, to be administered as she sees fit. Clara has been my partner in every sense of the word, and I trust her completely to honor our shared values in whatever decisions she may make regarding these assets. Murmurs of approval circled the table. This was expected, proper, exactly what everyone had assumed would happen. Sonia was nodding as well, still smiling, probably calculating what her portion of the remainder would be worth. To my brother David and his family, James continued, I leave my collection of first edition books and my workshop tools, knowing that they will be appreciated and used with the same care and respect that I tried to bring to every project. More nods, more approval. Edmund had been known for his beautiful handcrafted furniture, pieces that were scattered throughout family homes like treasures. To the various charitable organizations listed in Appendix A, I leave the amount specified, with the hope that these contributions will continue the work we supported during my lifetime. This was also expected. Edmund had been generous with his success, supporting causes from veterans organizations to children's hospitals. The amounts weren't specified in James's reading, but I knew they totaled nearly $2 million. Sonia was still smiling, still leaning forward, still waiting for her name to be called. Around the table, relatives were exchanging glances, some confused by the delay, others beginning to sense that something unusual was happening. Finally, James said, his voice taking on a different quality, more formal, more careful, more final, to my daughter, Sonia Oram Henderson. Here it was. The moment Sonia had been waiting for, the culmination of 32 years of expectation and entitlement. She sat up straighter in her chair, her smile broadening, her hands clasped together on the table like a child waiting for Christmas morning. To my daughter, Sonia, James repeated, his voice carrying across the silent room like a judge delivering a verdict, I leave the sum of exactly $1. The silence that followed was so complete it felt like the world had stopped spinning. No one moved, no one breathed. No one seemed to comprehend what they had just heard. Sonia's smile froze on her face like a mask that had suddenly become too heavy to wear. I'm sorry, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Could you repeat that? James reached into his portfolio and withdrew a crisp $1 bill, placing it carefully on the table in front of him. $1, he said clearly. Along with this note, written in your mother's hand. He unfolded a piece of cream-colored stationery, the same expensive paper we'd used for the invitations, and began to read in a voice that seemed to echo from every corner of the room. My dear daughter, I have left you $1, not because I don't love you, but because I do. Perhaps when you have nothing handed to you, you will finally learn the value of everything you've been given. Your father and I tried to teach you that family comes first, that respect is earned, and that privilege comes with responsibility. Since our words failed to reach you, perhaps our actions will. The money you expected to inherit has been donated to organizations that understand the value of service, sacrifice, and putting others before themselves, lessons we apparently failed to teach you adequately. I pray that one day you will understand that this is not punishment, it is education. I hope you will use this opportunity to discover who you are when you have to rely on your own character rather than your parents' bank account. All my love, Mother. The dollar bill sat on the table like an accusation, like evidence in a trial where the verdict had already been rendered. Around the room, 36 people sat in stunned silence, processing what they had just witnessed. Sonia stared at the money as if it were a snake that might bite her. Her face had gone through several colors, pale white, then bright red, then a mottled combination that suggested her blood pressure was reaching dangerous levels. "This is a joke," she said finally, her voice shaking. "This has to be some kind of sick joke." "I'm afraid not," James said gently. "These are your father's wishes, as modified by your mother in her capacity as executor of the estate." Modified. Sonia's voice was rising now, the careful composure she'd maintained throughout the reading beginning to crack. "What do you mean, modified?" I stood slowly, drawing myself up to my full height and fixing my daughter with the kind of look I'd been perfecting for 32 years of motherhood. "I mean, Sonia," I said in a voice that carried clearly to every corner of the room, "that I changed your inheritance after you chose to attend Marcus's birthday party instead of your father's funeral." The room erupted. Gasps and exclamations filled the air as relatives turned to each other in shock and dismay. Some looked at Sonia with expressions of horror, others with something that might have been sympathy, but most with the kind of disgust reserved for people who violate the most basic rules of human decency. "You changed it." Sonia was on her feet now, her careful composure completely shattered. "You can't do that. It's not legal." "It's not. It's completely legal," James interjected, his voice cutting through her protests with professional authority. "Your mother had full discretion as executor to modify the terms of your inheritance based on changed circumstances." Changed circumstances? Sonia was shouting now, all pretense of dignity abandoned. "What changed circumstances?" I walked around the table until I was standing directly in front of my daughter, close enough to see the tears of rage and disbelief beginning to form in her eyes. "The changed circumstance," I said quietly, "is that I finally realized I had raised a daughter who could choose a party over her father's funeral. A daughter who could post Instagram stories about her fabulous life, while her family buried the man who made that life possible. A daughter who could stand in this room and ask, what changed circumstances, as if her behavior was somehow acceptable." Sonia's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. Around the table, her relatives watched in fascination and horror as 32 years of enabling and excuses finally came to an end. "You're insane," she whispered finally. "You're a vindictive, bitter old woman who..." "Who what?" I asked calmly. "Who finally stopped pretending that your behavior was acceptable? Who finally stopped making excuses for your selfishness? Who finally realized that giving you everything you wanted was the worst thing I could do for your character?" Marcus had been silent throughout this exchange, but now he stood and placed a protective arm around Sonia's shoulders. "Mrs. Oram," he said, his voice carrying the kind of reasonable tone that suggested he still thought this could be fixed through charm and negotiation, "surely we can discuss this privately. Family matters shouldn't be aired in front of." "Family matters?" I turned my attention to him, studying his handsome face with the kind of clinical interest usually reserved for laboratory specimens. "You want to talk about family matters, Marcus? Tell me, what family matters were you and Sonia discussing when you were planning that birthday party? Did you consider for even a moment that it might conflict with her father's funeral?" Marcus's confident expression faltered. There were commitments that had been made months in advance. People were counting on us. We couldn't just. People were counting on you, I repeated. I see. And tell me, how many of those people had spent 35 years loving Sonia unconditionally? How many of them had worked 16-hour days to pay for her education, her wedding, her house, her lifestyle? How many of them had earned the right to expect her presence at the most important day of their lives? Marcus had no answer for that, and his silence spoke louder than any excuse he might have offered. I turned back to Sonia, who was staring at the dollar bill on the table as if she still couldn't believe what was happening. This is what you chose, I said softly. This is the consequence of 32 years of putting yourself first, of taking everything for granted, of assuming that your parents' love meant you never had to earn anyone's respect. I picked up the dollar bill and held it out to her. Take it, I said. It's yours. It's exactly what you've earned. For a moment, I thought she might hit me. Her face was flushed with rage and humiliation, her hands clenched into fists at her sides, her entire body vibrating with fury. Instead, she grabbed the dollar bill and threw it on the floor, grinding it under her designer heel as if she could somehow destroy the reality of what had just happened. You'll regret this, she hissed, her voice thick with tears and venom. You'll die alone and miserable, and I'll make sure everyone knows exactly what kind of mother you really are. I'm sure you will, I said calmly. Just as I'm sure that everyone who matters already knows exactly what kind of daughter you really are. Sonia looked around the table at the faces of her relatives, people who had watched her grow up, who had celebrated her successes and made excuses for her failures, who had hoped she would eventually mature into the woman her advantages should have produced. What she saw there was not sympathy or support, but disappointment and disgust. She saw the truth reflected in 36 pairs of eyes, and that truth was more devastating than any inheritance she might have lost. Without another word, she turned and stalked toward the door, Marcus trailing behind her like a confused puppy. At the threshold, she paused and looked back at me one last time. This isn't over, she said. Yes, I replied quietly. It is. The front door slammed with enough force to rattle the windows, and then she was gone, taking her rage and her entitlement and her wounded pride out of my house and out of my life. The silence that followed was different from the one that had greeted James's reading of the will. This was not the silence of shock, but the silence of people processing what they had witnessed, trying to understand how a family gathering had become a public execution. Finally, Edmund's brother David cleared his throat. Clara, he said gently, are you certain this was the right thing to do? I looked around the table at the faces of my family, people who had loved Edmund, who had watched Sonia grow up, who understood the years of patience and disappointment that had led to this moment. Yes, I said simply. For the first time in 32 years, I am absolutely certain. 3 years after Emma's adoption, I stood in the kitchen of my home preparing Sunday dinner for a family that had finally learned what love with boundaries looked like. Emma, now 9, sat at the counter helping me roll out pastry dough for her grandfather Edmund's favorite apple pie, a recipe I was teaching her with the same patience he had once shown me. Her small hands worked carefully, her tongue poking out in concentration as she tried to achieve the perfect thickness. Grandma Clara, she said without looking up from her work, Mommy says you used to give her everything she wanted when she was little. Is that true? I paused in my measuring, considering how to explain such a complex lesson to a child who is still forming her understanding of fairness and love. Yes, sweetheart, it is. And it wasn't good for her. Why not? I would like to get everything I wanted. I smiled, recognizing the honesty that only children possess. Getting everything you want doesn't teach you to be grateful for what you have. It doesn't help you learn to work for things or to appreciate the people who love you. Your mommy had to learn those lessons the hard way when she was much older than you are now. Emma nodded seriously. Is that why you make me do chores to earn my allowance? Exactly. Because I love you enough to teach you that good things come to people who work for them, who treat others with respect, and who understand that being part of a family means everyone contributes something. Through the window, I could see Sonia and David working in the garden Edmund had started decades ago, their hands dirty from planting the spring bulbs that would bloom long after I was gone. Sonia looked up and waved, her face bright with the kind of contentment that comes from a life built on genuine accomplishment rather than inherited privilege. She had kept her promise. For 3 years, she had continued working, saving, contributing to her community, and raising Emma with the values Edmund and I had tried to instill in her so many years ago. The inheritance that would legally become hers in 5 more years was no longer the center of her world. It was simply security for a future she was building with her own hands. "Grandma," Emma said, bringing my attention back to our baking project. "When I grow up, will you give me lots of money?" I looked down at this precious child who represented all the hopes our family had learned to nurture properly, and I gave her the same answer I wished I had given Sonia 30 years ago. "I'll give you something much more valuable than money, sweetheart. I'll give you the knowledge that you can earn whatever you need through your own character, your own work, and your own choices. Money comes and goes, but the strength to take care of yourself lasts forever." Emma considered this with the seriousness of someone already learning that the best gifts can't be wrapped in pretty paper. "That sounds better than money," she decided. "It is," I said, helping her transfer the pastry to our pie dish. "It's the only inheritance that can never be taken away from you." As the afternoon sun streamed through the kitchen windows, filling our home with warmth and the promise of family dinner shared in love and mutual respect, I felt Edmund's presence as clearly as if he were standing beside me. We had gotten our happy ending after all. Not the easy one we had once imagined, but the one we had earned through pain and growth and the courage to love each other enough to demand better. Some stories end with forgiveness. Others end with revenge. But the best stories, the ones worth telling, end with wisdom gained and love that has learned to set boundaries. This was one of those stories. And that's how a mother's tough love became a family's salvation. If this story moved you, if you recognized yourself in Clara's journey from enabler to empowered woman, then you're part of a community that understands the hardest truth of all. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to make someone's life easier. Hit that subscribe button right now because every Tuesday, Her True Stories brings you real women sharing the moments that changed everything. Stories of revenge that led to redemption, of boundaries that saved relationships, of women who chose their dignity over keeping the peace. Ring that notification bell so you never miss a story that could change how you see your own relationships, your own choices, your own power to demand respect. Share this video with someone who needs to hear that it's okay to have standards, okay to expect gratitude, okay to let people face the consequences of their actions, especially when you love them. And drop your story in the comments below. Have you ever had to choose tough love over easy forgiveness? Have you ever been called mean or unfair for setting boundaries that ultimately saved a relationship? This community gets it, and we want to hear from you. Remember, you are not responsible for fixing other people's poor choices. You are not required to accept disrespect in the name of love. And you are never, ever wrong for teaching someone that privilege comes with responsibility. This is Her True Stories, where women's voices matter, tough love gets celebrated, and every story ends with a woman who remembered her worth. Until next time, keep your standards high, your boundaries firm, and your self-respect non-negotiable. The world needs more women who know their value and refuse to accept less than they deserve.
Subscribe, share,
support other women, and never apologize for choosing dignity over convenience. See you tomorrow, warriors.